A big clutch of Space Marine datasheets today for the units for the Leviathan box. We've got rules for the Gravis Apothecary sampling the enemy to claim a whole bunch of objective points, Sternguard Veterans with double firing bolt rifles with mortal wounds, and a very slippery Tyranid hunting lieutenant that you're going to struggle to catch up with. Let's talk through the datasheets and what they can add for the Space Marines. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marine datasheets. And while Games Workshop have been teasing a fair few Space Marine datasheets throughout the previews for 10th edition, this is the first major collection that we've got all together, seeing both the front of them and their army construction side, and basically revealing how the Leviathan box is going to play as a unified force. In Games Workshop's recent Leviathan download, we've got the stat lines of all the units in the box, the Space Marines and the Tyranids. I've talked through the Tyranid ones in the previous video, so now let's talk about the Space Marines. Again, Games Workshop does seem to be keeping the points till last out of these previews, so we're not going to be getting any of those today. We will be able to see the units though, and how they work in game. Without further ado, let's jump into it and talk through some power armoured transhumans. First up, and leading the box, we have the Space Marine captured in Terminator armour. A pretty snazzy model, I think, with him stomping that Tyranid Carnifex head into the dirt. And perhaps one of the most interesting things was just how flexible his war gear is. He isn't just locked to the selections that you can take in the box, the Relic Blaze plus the Stormbolter. You can also take pretty much all the other classic Terminator weapons, Stormbolters, Power Fists and Chain Fists, Thunderhammers and Storm Shields, a dual pair of Lightning Claws, and also a combi weapon if you'd like to swap out that Stormbolter. It's also got the option for taking an auxiliary grenade launcher if your model's armed with a power fist, so I guess that's going to be an option as well. It looks to me like this kit very heavily hints at really quite a flexible new model for the Terminator Captain. Lots of these aren't options for the leaders currently, and are only choices that you can take on basic squads. We also find out the squads that he can lead: the Relic Terminator Squad, the Terminator Assault Squad, and the regular Terminator Squad. Seems that Relic Terminators aren't going anywhere just yet. I was kind of wondering whether that datasheet might or might not be kept to Horus Heresy. I guess it's still not 100% possible that they could have been sent to Legends and they're just mentioned on this datasheet for completeness, but my guess is probably not if they are being listed as a unit that they can lead. Hopefully they'll still be a fully functional part of the Space Marine Codex. Otherwise, stats-wise, here's the full model. He's a toughness 5 character with a 2+ save and 6 wounds, and the big tanky new 4+ Terminator Invul. The melee weapons are kind of interesting to go through. They generally tend to have decent trade-offs for different purposes. The Lightning Claws give you 7 attacks at Strength 5, AP 1 and Twin Links, so he gets to reroll the wound rolls there. It's the only one with damage 1 though. The Relic weapon is only strength 5, but gets 6 accurate attacks at damage 2. The Power Fist only gets the 5 attacks, but it hits on strength 8, so maybe a bit better at killing heavy infantry. The Chain Fist is like a Power Fist, but -1 to hit and anti-vehicle. And the Thunderhammer is kind of similar to the Power Fist, but again -1 to hit, but picks up devastating wounds to handle tough stuff. I did a bit of a breakdown on a previous video on the Terminator Captain between the weapon loadouts. I feel like maybe the Thunderhammer and the Power Fist shake out to be some of the best overall, though I'd say pretty much all of them are usable depending on what you're going for. There's also the option of a Relic Shield to replace his shooting attack if you'd like. That can put him up to a wounds characteristic of 7, so a tiny bit more tough. I think I'd probably keep the gun though myself, and he can take the auxiliary grenade launcher for the Power Fist. That gives the unit the grenades keyword, so allows that stratagem. He would need to be pretty close to do that though, but it could be a decent way to hand out some mortal wounds. Probably not going to be too exciting unless it's free. Otherwise, he grants the unit his leading 2 different boosts, reroll charges, which is quite nice, particularly out of Deep Strike, and perhaps more importantly, he's going to allow the unit to get some free stratagems to go off on it. Once per battle round, when you target his unit with a stratagem, it becomes completely free. Could be something like Overwatch for a flurry of Stormbolter fire, +1 to your saves via that Armour of Contempt one, the Combat Interrupt stratagem, or even just a command point reroll to reroll a failed Invul save for a Terminator could be pretty big if it saves one of their lives. Overall looks pretty interesting, I think. The free stratagem might have some pretty massive value given that the unit's a big tough one that you likely want to buff with strats. Next up we've got the Infernus Squad. The new Space Marines with the Pyroblasters. They basically have an Intercessor style stat line but with Objective Control 1, not Objective Control 2, and they pack the Pyroblaster Flamer, 12-inch range and D6 auto hits, all at strength 5, AP 0, damage 1, ignoring cover. Not going to be too exciting against anything massively heavy, but pretty brutal against hordes, plus again a very interesting target for that Overwatch stratagem. If the enemy does stray too close to them, then they're going to be taking an enormous amount of auto hits. Otherwise they aren't battle lines, so I guess they're not really being seen as the troops role, being seen as more specialists similar to Hellblasters, I guess. And their special rule is to hand out Battle Shock to one enemy infantry unit that gets hit by their attacks. Again, definitely handy enough, and might prevent units from using stratagems later in the turn, though probably isn't going to be the biggest deal in the world for objectives and things. Battle Shock handed out in your own turn isn't going to affect the enemy after their command phase happens. Overall, I feel like they're potentially interesting, but are going to face a whole ton of competition within the Space Marine army. There's a whole load of different flavours of intercessors out there that have better objective control. I guess big close range anti-infantry and powerful overwatch are their biggest selling points. In some games that could really matter, but they don't seem quite as general purpose as some maybe. Next up, we've got our first new datasheet of the day with the Sternguard Veterans Squad. These new updated Primaris guys have 5 to 10 models in the unit now, and it seems from their army construction sheets they can all either choose to take either combi weapons or their Sternguard pattern bolt rifles, which are a bit boosted over the standard. 1 per 5 can also choose to take a heavy bolter as well, probably for an increased cost. Statline wise, they're basically the same as the Infernus Squad, intercessor profiles with an objective control of 1. Veteran Space Marines packing some interesting bolter profiles. Out of the two main options, if they do actually remain the same points cost, which I'd guess they probably would, the Sternguard bolt rifle I think probably looks the better of the two. This one seems pretty similar to the intercessor pattern bolt rifle, with 2 shots with both the heavy and the assault keyword and AP-1, so you could either move quite fast with them or stay still to hit on 2s. Interestingly, it's a rapid fire weapon with 2 shots base, so you're always getting 2 shots at 24 inches, and then you get a bonus 3rd shot at 12 inches, so really quite a high rate of fire out of these guys up close. Then on top of that you also have the devastating wounds keyword as well, so wound rolls of a 6 become a mortal wound. That will mean that even the toughest stuff in the game can't ignore these bolters. Out of the two, I feel like they outcompete the combi weapons, which are the same profile for all of them, whether it's a combi melter or combi flamer. Anti-infantry 4+ and devastating wounds, but only hit on a 4, and don't get the extra bonus as a shot at 24 inches. There are some targets that they'll be better at, where the mortal wounds are more important against the infantry, but I feel like the bolt rifle's probably the better generalist profile. Otherwise, I think it's kind of fun that the Sternguard bolt pistols and heavy bolter also get devastating wounds. I guess that's very much going to be their thing, slightly more terrifying bolt weapons. And then beyond that, they don't have any options for things like combat weapons, and no option for special weapons recorded here at least. It seems that either those options might just be completely lost, or I suppose it's not impossible that we get a full plastic Sternguard release when the codex drops, and they might well add them back in then. Not sure which way they'll go on that one, they might just keep them entirely focused on the bolters. Talking of which though, besides having fairly brutal bolter fire, the Sternguard also have a really quite powerful special rule called Bolter Drill. Basically a pretty reasonable chance for a second volley of shots, provided you can find something that's on its last legs for them to finish off. It's only once per game, so I guess there's just going to be one turn when the Sternguard hit extra hard. If the unit manages to kill an enemy unit with its volley of fire, then once per game you get to fire the unit all over again in that same shooting phase, and just throw a whole load more of devastating wound bolt shots into something completely different. This really seems like a pretty huge boost to me. I guess you'd probably want to do it on the turn that they first get exposed to the enemy and they get their full volley of fire. Ideally you might want to try and whittle down one enemy unit, try and finish them off with the Sternguard, and then just throw as many dangerous bolt shots as you can into your next target. That does seem quite nice. I feel like maybe 10 of these arriving in a drop pod could be pretty terrifying. Kill one unit, and then hopefully kill a second. Overall, I feel like they seem fairly general purpose, though again definitely with an anti-infantry slant. Will be interesting to see where their points cost has them wind up. I feel like they will quite like the Space Marine Oath of Moment battlefield rule as well. 4 rerolls to wound with devastating wounds low strength weapons seems pretty amazing. Just fish for as many 6s as you can. Next up, we've got the big stompy range Dreadnought in the Ballistus. Toughness 12, 10 wounds and a 2+ save. It has lost the -1 damage that Dreadnoughts had previously. Overall though, still seems very tanky. Having 2+ armor is quite nice with a little bit less AP in the game now. Damage 2 weapons might just be a bit more of a threat to it though. Weapons wise, it doesn't look like this guy has any options yet. Wouldn't be too surprised if they followed it up with a multi-part plastic kit, maybe with an alternate main weapon and options like the Fragstorm grenades instead of the Storm Bolters. But it seems that fresh from the Leviathan box it gets 2 las cannon shots with the new strength 12 and damage d6+1 profile, and then 2 missile shots with basically a missile launch with +1 strength, strength 10 crack shots, and strength 5 frag. It's also got that Twin Links pair of Storm Bolters too. The Ballistus' special rule is quite a good one. Reroll hit rolls against your target unless it's below half strength. Usually that means that it's just going to be getting these hit rolls without thinking too hard. It might just mean that every so often it randomly drops in damage output though. If you do need to try and put the finishing blow on an injured unit, might just be a little bit less reliable there. Still though, with the rerolls it's fairly brutal, around about 7 wounds on average to a Rhino tank, or around about 4 to a Land Raider. Seems solid enough range threats, though it will be competing with an absolute ton of other Space Marine units. We'll see how this guy stacks up against things like Devastators, Eradicators, Gladiator tanks, and all the various things with multi-melters. Next up, we've got the new and chunky Terminator Squad, 5 to 10 models in the unit, and all of them at toughness 5 with a 4+ invul, very hard to remove from the board now, particularly with light infantry with strength 4 weapons. For options in the unit, it hasn't really changed too much. 1 per 5 can take one of the heavy weapons, the assault cannon, cyclone missiles, or the heavy flamer. The sergeant still has to take a power weapon and can't take the power fist, though I guess without the sergeant having any sort of boost to leadership or anything now, you could take the sergeant off as a casualty earlier if you fancied. Otherwise, the rest of the units in the squad can either choose chain fist or power fist. As with the captain, the chain fist is going to be -1 to hit, but gains anti-vehicle 3+, so is going to be far better than the power fist at downing armor. For the ranged weapons, I still think that the Cyclone Missile Launcher probably looks like the best value overall, though it's probably going to cost more points as a result. I do quite like the Assault Cannon though, with devastating wounds. Again, that's going to be a weapon that really likes Oath of Moment for unrestricted wound rerolls. The Storm Bolters can no longer rapid fire at 24 inches as Bolter Discipline's gone away. They're basically 4 shots at 12 inches now, or 2 at 24. And on top of all of that, they basically get a trio of different special rules. Free rapid ingress if they choose to drop near a pre-designated point with that cool teleport marker. Even just labelling a drop site could maybe spook your opponents and might make them want to move in a different way. They innately ignore weapon skill and ballistic skill modifiers and to hit roll modifiers, so that's quite nice against stealth I suppose. And also they get a +1 to hit against any Oath of Moment targets as well. Maybe not the most exciting thing in the world, given that you've already got 4 rerolls. I guess it might be kind of relevant for the Chain Fist though. Overall, the new flavour of the Terminators seems massively more tanky, although maybe a little bit less dangerous than before. Perhaps feels like one of the units that epitomises a few trends in 9th edition, going to increased durability but a bit less damage. Next up, we've got a very slippery and sneaky Lieutenant with the Combi Weapon Lieutenant. Interestingly, he's written here as Lieutenant with Combi Weapon, no mention of Phobos armor or anything like that. He's the rather cool Tyranid hunting one with the Envenomed Blade, a Gaunt Claw knife, and a shoulder pad repaired by Tyranid chitin. This guy does function a fair bit differently to how I might have guessed. I was expecting him to be a leader in a Phobos type unit, but that doesn't seem to be his role. Instead, this guy seems to be a lone operative, so you can't shoot him greater than 12 inches. You get stealth when you can for a -1 to hit, and even a feel no pain type save as well of 5+. And between that little lot, despite the fact that he's got a kind of weedy stat line with toughness 4, 4 wounds, and no invul or anything, it does mean that he might be just a little bit surprisingly harder to kill than you'd guess. Realistically though, it's going to be actually really quite hard to catch up with him. The Lieutenant's got a special rule that if an enemy unit finishes a move within 9 inches of him, he can immediately make a normal move of 6 inches. That means that, say, if you had an enemy infantry unit that could just make it into 12 inches to shoot him with their guns, then he could just casually move away a little bit, so he'd be out of lone operative range again. It's also very solid insurance against getting charged. Overall, as a character, he feels really quite sneaky and hard to catch up with, though his damage dealing isn't really all that impressive, I don't think. The combi weapon unfortunately just gets the standard profile that all the rest do, just simply a rapid fire weapon with the anti-infantry and devastating wounds rules, and he hits on a 3+ with it. Good for a mortal wound or 2 against some infantry, but not really much more. In combat, he strikes with those Incursor-style paired combat blades, 5 attacks hitting on a 2+, strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. On top of that, he gets the sustained hits and anti-Tyranid keywords. He'll always wound the bugs on a 4+ or better, but still when you're AP 0 and -1, unless he's fighting against Horde units, then he's not going to be doing all that well. I feel like maybe a little bit of AP might not have gone amiss too much on him, just to make him a little bit more of a credible melee threat, even if he's not punching with equivalents of Power Fist and things. Finally, and perhaps besides the fun shenanigans, maybe the main reason to bring him is his damage boost that he can give you. He's got a kind of interesting special rule where he gets to nominate an objective at the start of the first battle round, and if the opponent tries to take it with their units, then units within 6 inches of him get to reroll a wound roll of 1 against the units that are taking it. Kind of like old Lieutenant style rerolls, but realistically a lot more limited, as you have to focus on one section of the board, and it's not just a generic buff. Overall, I'd say that this guy maybe isn't the most exciting in the world. I feel like the buff is just a little bit on the situational side, requires your opponents to obligingly move their units where you want them to, and even if they do, then it's not exactly the biggest damage boost in the world. I suppose you could potentially push on some pretty big guns though. In general, it feels like a unit that's got some really interesting special rules for keeping safe and doing a bit of guerrilla warfare, but maybe just not really the damage output to really back that up. I suppose he could take a chunk out of some infantry units. Hopefully he winds up being kind of cheap, as otherwise I don't think he's going to get played very much. Next up, and perhaps one of the units that I most wanted to find out what happened with him when I was looking at these datasheets, here we have the Apothecary Biologis, basically the scientists for the Space Marines that study in the Tyranids and how to kill them. As basically a Gravis armored apothecary, he can join aggressors, eradicators, or heavy intercessors, no leading stuff in less chunky armor. He's allowed to join the unit even if a captain or chapter mastered model joins the unit, so he potentially can combine his buffs with other ones. His stat line's kind of mediocre, he's not exactly a frontline combat character, a single shot with a damage 2 bolt pistol at strength 5 AP-1, just a few strength 4 attacks in close combat with no AP, though he does confirm that Gravis armor is going to be going up to a chunky toughness 6, as was kind of hinted by Games Workshop before. Seems like it might be shaking out in a similar sort of way to the Terminators last time, more toughness but worse save and no invul. Otherwise for your unit he basically does two other interesting things. He'll give the unit lethal hits, so auto wounds on 6s. That applies both to range and melee. It kind of feels like he's doing the job of the Primaris Lieutenant that we saw previewed, but for Gravis Armor Marines. Lethal hits really is quite a solid buff, particularly against tough stuff. I feel like all the units that he can lead could potentially benefit from that. Even the Eradicators, who have higher strength than most, they're still only strength 9, so will be wounding toughness 12 vehicles on a 5+. Seems pretty good for the more mid-strength aggressors and the heavy intercessors though. Otherwise, his other interesting special rule is that he grants a bit more objective control. He himself is objective control 3, which is kind of unusual for a character just in itself, and if the unit manages to wipe out an enemy unit in melee, he can do a little bit of sampling, and he goes up to an objective control of 9 instead. That's really quite a big deal to be honest. It's going to have the same sort of objective control as entire squads worth of enemies. And when you add that to the likely 1 point that he'll be getting from things like aggressors or eradicators, seems kind of fun. I think maybe the only small disappointment for me is that he doesn't have any apothecary style healing rules. I know Games Workshop said that he's basically a battlefield scientist and not designated as a healer, but it just feels a bit contrary to most of the apothecaries that we've seen in the game so far. Might have just been fun to have a 6+ feel no pain, or some minor way of healing the unit even if it wasn't all that powerful. It's just a bit surprising that he basically functions as sort of like a lieutenant equivalent. Still though, a pretty fun model. If it's costed right, then lethal hits on one of those very dangerous units could be fun. Finally, last but not least, we have our new Runic Librarian in Terminator armor. Again, like the Captain, he can lead any of the 3 new Terminator variants, the regular ones, the assault ones, or the relic ones, though it does appear that he lacks any sort of rule to join the same squad as a Terminator Captain led one, which I guess means it's a little bit awkward for the Leviathan box, as either the Terminator Captain or the Librarian will be wandering around on their own. Maybe a little bit annoying for the Combat Patrol as well, the one that you can build from the box. I guess the new Terminator profile is at least pretty tanky though. For what he brings to the table, he's got a little bit of melee with the Force Axe at strength 6, AP1 and damage D3. He's got the new version of Smite, which is now his thing again, as opposed to just something for everyone in the game. On its focus mode, it's D6 shots, hitting on a 3+, strength 6, AP-2 and damage D3 with devastating wounds, though it is hazardous so he's got the chance to take some mortals. Might be worth budgeting a command point to give you the chance to reroll that 1 if you do get unlucky on the hazardous and risk taking 3 mortal wounds. Otherwise, for his datasheet options, he's only got the choice of a Stormbolter or a combi weapon. Both seem kind of okay. I might be a bit more tempted by the Stormbolter myself, perhaps. And then he gives 2 different buffs to the unit, a 4+ defense against psychic attacks, which do seem like they could be quite common given the units that we've seen previewed so far. I guess goes with his lore with the psychic hood as well. And he also gives a damage buff for the unit as well with Veil of Time. This one gives the unit sustained hits 1, basically a nice flat damage boost for the unit with extra hits on 6s. Kind of interesting that he is now the generic damage buff option for a Terminator unit, whereas the Captain does reroll charges and free stratagems. Overall looks pretty solid to me. A little bit of extra shooting, plus a bit of a damage boost. Terminators do seem like a big and chunky enough unit that you could justify a leader in. So anyway, there we have it for all the Space Marine datasheets in the Leviathan box. Looking like a pretty fun collection there. And it's been cool to see some of the new ones with the Apothecary, Lieutenants, and the new Sternguard Veterans. After the new units that we've learned about today, I feel like maybe the Sternguard Veteran Squad and the Apothecary are my favourite too. Lethal hits on something like Aggressors seems pretty decent if they wind up being somewhat efficient, and at least find the idea of mortal wound bolters pretty fun with the Sternguard. Should mean that they're a little bit more general purpose than a lot of bolter armed units, and they can certainly put out a decent hail of fire between the 3 shots at 12-inch range, plus the potential to shoot twice with bolter drill. Hopefully Games Workshop will grace us with some points at some stage, so we can start putting all of this in a bit more context. In any case, let me know which units you're most pumped for from the Leviathan box. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. And feel free to check out my counterpart video to this, going through similarly for the Tyranid datasheets. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos and updates on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and if you'd like to help support these videos coming, then feel free to give it a look. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.